Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's lecture by Professor Celeste Kidd from the University of California in Berkeley. You're all very welcome this evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Tomas Ryan. I'm an associate professor in the Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience and co-organizer of the Neurohumanities public lecture series, which is generously sponsored by the Wellcome Trust through an institutional support framework grant led by Professor Mani Ramaswamy, the director of the Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience. I'm not going to introduce Celeste myself. That's going to be done by Professor Claire Kelly. But just a couple of quick announcements. After the lecture, we will have an interview that will be chaired by Professor Kelly, and we will also field questions from the audience during that time. And overall, the event should be completed by about 7:30 p.m. The event is co-hosted with Women in Research Ireland, and I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Roisin Loftus and Dr. Lydia Dick for helping in the organization and the coordination of the event. The event, as I said, is chaired by Professor Claire Kelly from the Trinity Institute of Neuroscience, who is the Usher Assistant Professor of Neuroimaging in the Department of Psychology and the Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience. Claire is one of Ireland's 3 most highly cited researchers, despite her age, and the single most highly cited female researcher in the country. But before Claire introduces Celeste, the event will be opened in the Irish context by someone who needs no introduction, the Reid Professor of Criminal Law at Trinity College Dublin, Senator for the Dublin University constituency, leader of the Irish Labour Party in Shannon, and longtime human rights activist and progressive political campaigner. Please welcome Senator Ivana Bacik.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Tomas, and apologies if I'm a little hoarse. I've just delivered a 2-hour lecture on criminal law in this same room. So apologies also to any of my students who stayed on, because you've already been subjected to 2 hours of me this afternoon, and that's a lot. So I'm delighted to be here and really honoured to have been asked to speak this evening just before Celeste Kidd, who of course is a great hero of mine and indeed has done so much to highlight the extent and issue of sexual harassment on campuses through her work in the US. And I know Claire is going to introduce Celeste, but just to say, you know, it's great to have you here, and it's very timely that you're here, I think, as we are debating this issue here as well in the context of academia. So I just wanted to thank Roisin and Tomas and Claire for the invitation to speak. And to say that, you know, it's timely, of course, because less than 2 years after the Me Too movement really began to spark international headlines in late 2017, things have moved on hugely internationally and in the domestic sphere in terms of highlighting of sexual harassment and in academia and elsewhere. And discussing this earlier with Celeste, I think it's fair to say that in Ireland the focus has been less on the academy, less on third-level institutions, and more in other sectors of society. And I think we've seen in particular, even predating the Me Too movement, women, feminist activists in the arts and in the theatre in particular, really raising this as an issue. And I'm thinking, of course, of Grace Diaz, and I'm thinking of the Waking the Feminists movement, which kicked off in 2015 here, but which really began to generate, I think, a good deal of attention at last, long overdue attention, on issues of discrimination and unfair treatment and indeed sexual harassment in theatre and the arts. So it's really there that there's been a huge focus in public debate. And I'll speak a little more about the legal context briefly, but just to say, in terms of sexual harassment in academia specifically, we have seen more of a focus return to that in recent months. And just last Friday, we saw the launch by the relevant minister, Mary Mitchell O'Connor, of a new framework and €400,000 in funding for higher education institutes to tackle sexual violence and harassment on campus. And we just saw in March of this year, the National Women's Council report launching its very effective toolkit on sexual harassment in third-level institutions, entitled It Stops Now. And that's the hashtag It Stops Now. The National Women's Council has been doing research that's EU funded called the ESHTE project, Ending Sexual Violence and Harassment in Third Level Education. They've worked with partners from other jurisdictions, and the toolkit is the culmination of that research. But that work really builds on work that students had done already through USI. And back in 2013, I launched a survey that USI had generated, the Say Something report, in which they made significant findings based on responses from 2,700 students, over 80% of whom were undergraduates. Those findings, rather alarmingly, being that 11% of the women respondents have been subjected to unwanted sexual contact in campus, and an additional 5% were survivors of rape. So the fact that there hasn't been huge public focus on sexual harassment and sexual violence and abuse in academia doesn't mean that it hasn't been a huge issue, but it's just been underreported, I think, and perhaps we haven't put sufficient emphasis on it. I think, again, this is timely because of these initiatives culminating so recently. I think to talk tonight is also timely because, of course, we're now in the process of the Athena Swan programme here in Trinity, and indeed in other third-level institutions across the country. Athena Swan being the award scheme for gender equality practices in higher education. And it's a subject very close to my own heart because I've just been asked to convene the law school Athena Swan process in Trinity, and I know a lot of other schools are ahead, particularly in the sciences, but in the Faculty of Arts Humanities, quite a number of us in schools in Arts Humanities are working on achieving a bronze award next year. And as part of that, we have to survey staff and students about experiences, about their impressions of gender equality treatment practices on campus. And I think that will make for very interesting and very illuminating findings. And I'm delighted Professor Eileen Drew, who's been leading this on campus, is here, and indeed Tony McMahon as well. So there's been a great deal of work ongoing on campus on this. I should say that Eileen and I did a study some years ago now, Eileen, 2003, on gender discrimination in the legal professions, published as Gender Injustice, with our colleague Catherine Costello. And we found in that survey, as Eileen will recall, that 14% of women practicing as lawyers had experienced sexual harassment in a workplace context. And at the time, certainly those findings did receive a good deal of publicity, and a good deal of steps have been taken since to address this. So this is an issue that does require significant focus. What is the legal context in Ireland? And I'm just going to speak briefly on that before handing over to Celeste and to Claire. We know that in Ireland the true extent of sexual harassment and abuse is largely underreported, as it is elsewhere. And that in recent years, as the Me Too movement, the It Stops Now campaign, and indeed Waking the Feminists and the I Believe Her movement generated by the Belfast rape trial as a response to that, these movements have caused really an increase in levels of reporting and in levels of highlighting of sexual harassment. And as a result, we've seen legal responses shifting, and we've seen renewed focus in law and politics. Certainly after the Me Too movement, a group of us did put together a toolkit on how to deal with sexual harassment, similar to the toolkit that the National Women's Council has developed for higher education institutions. But one of the key issues we really wanted to focus on, which I think is very important for anyone looking at the law on this, is the distinction between criminal and civil liability on sexual harassment. I think it's something that's often not understood or glossed over in discussion about this, that quite a lot of sexual harassment is in fact not a criminal offence, doesn't amount to a criminal offence, that the criminal definitions of sexual harassment are quite specific, and that only certain behaviours fall within that category. And we do have criminal laws now against sexual harassment, but we also have civil laws against sexual harassment. So even those forms of sexual harassment that are not criminally prosecutable as crime can still be civilly actionable. And so, for example, in Section 14A of the 1998 Equality Act, we see harassment defined as any form of unwanted conduct related to any of the discriminatory grounds. And we have 9 discriminatory grounds in Irish equality legislation. And in the same section, sexual harassment is defined specifically as covering unwanted verbal, non-verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. So that is civilly actionable sexual harassment, different to the forms of harassment criminalised in our 1997 Non-Fatal Offences Against the Person Act, Section 10, which requires proof of persistently following, watching, pestering, besetting, or communicating with a person. So the criminal and the civil are rather different. Clearly, we do have extensive criminal law dealing with sexual assaults, aggravated sexual assaults and rapes. But a large amount of unwanted behaviour, unwanted verbal, non-verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature will not fall necessarily into the criminal sphere. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be taking action on it. And in fact, if anything, that's the form of conduct that it's more important to highlight, because it's the more pervasive and the more persistent in a workplace context. And I suppose I just want to finish by saying that any consideration of sexual harassment has to also, in law or indeed in politics or in academia, must also focus on intersectionality and on power relations, because the reality, as we know from any survey being conducted on harassment, is that those who are in power have much greater opportunity to harass, and that those who are powerless are much more likely to be victims of harassment, and that goes wherever, whether we're in academia or in law or in politics or in any other sphere, and that this is about power abuse and abuse of power as much as anything else. And while the law, criminal and civil law, can and must be strengthened to deal with this, and we have, as I've said, new laws on victims' rights. We've new laws defining consent for the first time since 2017 in the context of sexual offences and so on. So these are very important. But a lot of the work to be done has to be done through public awareness campaigns, through initiatives like the Women's Council, through initiatives like the Me Too movement, and through public lectures and talks of this kind. So, Gurmagwev, thank you very much, and looking forward very much to hearing Celeste speak now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana, for that wonderful introduction to the topic and the Irish context. So good evening, everyone. I'm Claire Kelly. I'm an assistant professor here in Trinity, as Tomas mentioned. And I study how our brains and thinking change over development. So I know Professor Celeste Kidd, first and foremost, through her highly inventive and perceptive work on cognitive development, some of which has yielded insights that have prompted researchers to revise and reconceptualize long-standing theories of children's capacities and behaviors. So Celeste's academic career began in the University of Southern California, where she completed a joint honors degree in linguistics and print journalism, graduating in 2007. So she was fascinated by infant learning and set her sights on the University of Rochester, which is in New York State, and the lab of Richard Aslin for her postgraduate career. And in Aslin's lab, Celeste launched a line of really clever and innovative studies that yielded new insights into how infants choose what to pay attention to in order to learn from their environments. So this included, for example, evidence of a Goldilocks effect for both vision and audition, where infants show a preference for environmental inputs that have just the right level of complexity to facilitate learning, so not too little and not too much. The one characteristic that sets Celeste's work apart is the application of really sophisticated computational modeling techniques to gain a better understanding of infant cognition and behavior. And as an independent investigator, first at the University of Rochester, but now at the University of California, Berkeley, Celeste combines these techniques with really careful observation and behavioral measurements of infants and children to better understand how and why children play, how they learn, and how they remember. And these studies yield answers that not only tell us about how infants learn about their worlds, but also provide really profound insights into fundamental human traits and capacities like curiosity and intelligence. So, for example, in a 2016 paper from Celeste and her colleague Steve Piantadosi, applied mathematical modeling to demonstrate that the evolutionary expansion of intelligence that separates humans from our primate cousins may have been driven by the helplessness of our babies, because helpless babies need really smart parents to take care of them. So Celeste's work is not just scientifically and academically outstanding, it's really accessible and has really broad appeal. And as a result, she and her work have featured regularly in a variety of media outlets, including New York Times, Scientific American, Psychology Today, BBC World, and even our own Moncrief show on News Talk. But in 2017, Celeste made the cover of a magazine for a very different reason. She featured on the cover of Time magazine's Person of the Year issue. And that year, the magazine didn't select one person, but 17 silence breakers, men and women who risked their careers, livelihoods, and reputations by going public with allegations of sexual harassment and assault in Hollywood, politics, the media, academia, and beyond. And Celeste was one of these women, was one of these because she had recently brought her employer, the University of Rochester, to task and to court for failing to address significant and repeated sexual harassment and discrimination perpetuated by Florian Jaeger, who was and still is a professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. The efforts of Celeste and colleagues such as Jessica Cantillon who shone a spotlight on a culture of sexual discrimination that exists within academia that quite literally ruins dreams and careers by impeding progress, limiting opportunities, or simply driving people out of research in academia. So Celeste's courage in speaking out against both her harasser and the institution that failed to protect her fellow colleagues, researchers, and students from harassment played a major role in igniting the Me Too and Me Too STEM movements. And these movements have been absolutely pivotal, not only in holding harassers and institutions that protect them to account, but also in giving a voice to long-silenced victims whose stories have opened up new conversations about culture, power and hierarchy, and gender inequality. So this evening, we're honored to have Celeste here to speak as part of the Neuromanities public talk series to share her perspectives on how sexual harassment creates inequality in academia.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here to speak. I was honored by the invitation, and I'm excited and humbled by how many people here care deeply about these issues. Today, I plan to talk about how harassment causes inequality in academia, but before I do that, I want to start in a little bit of a predictable place by clarifying what I mean when I say sexual harassment. Sexual harassment can take many forms. That includes gender harassment, which are behaviors that convey hostility, objectify, exclude, or convey second-class citizenship for members of one gender. It also includes unwanted sexual attention, which is unwelcome sexual advances, including sexual assault, and sexual coercion, which is when favorable professional or educational treatment is conditioned upon sexual activity, but also when undesirable treatment or punishment is conditioned on failure to tolerate or comply with the other sexualized behavior. It's a civil rights issue, as has already been alluded to, because it's a form of discrimination that prevents equal access to training and professional opportunities. I like what you said about it. It quite literally throws people off the course to their dreams and their careers. It disproportionately impacts women and other groups that are already underrepresented in the workplace, including non-white and LGBTQ individuals, which makes it a serious threat to diversity. The intersectionality issues are very important. So this is my plan today. I'm going to share some of my background, but well beyond that, I'm hoping to shed some light on the big challenges in tackling sexual misconduct in general. In the end, I'll introduce some ideas for solutions. I'm now an assistant professor in psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. but I'm formerly a junior member a junior faculty member at the University of Rochester in upstate New York. I was one of 9 faculty who filed a federal lawsuit against the University of Rochester over sexual harassment and retaliation in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. That lawsuit is ongoing. I was also a graduate student in that same department. And during that time, I was subjected to demoralizing and unrelenting sexual harassment by a professor named Florian Jaeger, who that department still employs. He exploited his position of authority over me and other women to demean, antagonize, and intimidate us as trainees who lacked the power to protect ourselves from his abuses. As a student in Florian's lab, I was subjected to a daily barrage of unwanted commentary about his sexual desires, including for students who were my friends and classmates. He described his lust for their physical attributes while simultaneously insulting their intelligence and disparaging their professional accomplishments. These kinds of comments were not subtle. For example, he complained to me about the taste of my classmate's vagina. When I protested, he elaborated. The University of Rochester's latest investigation credited that these comments and behaviors occurred not just to me, but to many others. If you're at this point wondering how egregious this professor's behavior was, these are just some of the behaviors that were confirmed by the university's own investigation, which was very conservative. The investigation confirmed that he objectified women, used sexualized language in academic settings, sent an unwanted picture of his penis to one student and an unwanted racy picture to another. He had 4 consensual relationships with students, including one undergraduate student, characterized as problematic and an inherent asymmetry of power. He had sexual relationships with at least 4 other women he helped bring to Rochester to give academic talks. He had loud sex that students did not want to hear but could. He used drugs at retreats, leading to a hospital visit. He served on a thesis committee for a student that he'd had sex with. He mentored and wrote recommendation letters for a student while in a sexual relationship with her. He caused students to miss out on educational opportunities because they specifically avoided him. These were all things that the university confirmed happened. That list, however horrible, is in no way exhaustive. It does not convey the level of humiliation that we were subjected to on a daily basis. He told me and others that I was too tightly wound and needed to have sex to relax. He made similar comments to my classmates. When I expressed disgust or asked him to stop, he instead got worse. He relished in my suffering. When I complained, he called me juvenile. He told me that if I didn't learn the ways of the world quickly, he'd have no choice but to tell my future potential employers how stubborn, stupid, and childlike I was. He said he was close to everyone important in the field and that they'd rely on him for his professional opinion of me. He lauded his power over my head and reminded me that no one knew who I was yet. And it could have stayed that way. He very well could have ruined me. I saw him do it to others. I saw him make phone calls and write emails that destroyed the reputations of students before the field had a chance to judge their scientific capability for themselves. I saw him make fun of visiting speakers' intelligence behind their backs and then later sleep with them. He mercilessly disparaged women who complained about his behavior at conferences, behind their backs, but in front of my and my classmates' faces. This was a warning of what could happen to the rest of us. This illustrates a really important part of how harassment works. It targets people who lack the power to protect themselves from it. This is true everywhere, but it's especially salient in academia because of the opportunity issue, where power is more concentrated and the hierarchies are more clearly delineated. For example, in a recent study of harassment at scientific fieldwork sites, researchers found that 90% of women who were harassed were lower in rank or position, and 70% of men. Harassers seek out people who they can control, and being out in the field and being junior are 2 ways in which they can isolate and control victims. Fieldwork sites are also breeding grounds for abuse because the abuse can happen with few witnesses to confirm or intervene. Among academic fields, harassment is most pronounced in medicine, where the faculty wield substantially more power over students' careers than in other areas of training. Almost half of women in medicine reported experiencing some form of power-based harassment. That's compared to approximately 1 in 5 in academia at large. Like most who experience sexual harassment in my position, I knew my chance of being listened to was slight. I had no means to protect myself from the merciless retaliation that I was sure to follow complaining any louder than I already had. So I did what little was within my power to try to protect myself. I cut off all contact with Florian. I dropped all projects in his lab, and I dramatically changed my area of research to protect myself from the defamation that I knew was going to follow my departure. My undergraduate degree was in linguistics. I had intended to study language acquisition. I stopped doing language research entirely. By changing my area of research, a luxury most graduate students or employees don't have, I managed to avoid him professionally. I published in areas outside of his influence, and I was academically successful. I am still here to talk to you today about these issues because I had a number of privileges that most people don't have, like the ability to change research areas and research mentors. Also because I was incredibly lucky. Most students and employees don't have these options. When they complain and are retaliated against, they're backed into a corner with nowhere to run and nothing else to do except for drop out entirely. The most recent EEOC study on the subject found that retaliation occurred for 75% of harassment victims when they complained. The point of this is that the retaliation was not exceptional in my case. It was completely the norm. I would add here also that this is a study of workplace behavior in general. There's also studies that suggest that the problem is likely to be worse because of opportunity in academia. So this is likely an underestimate of what the true rate of retaliation is in academia. Retaliation is completely the norm. Retaliation can take many forms, including reputational damage, exclusion, threats, and demotions. Because of the large amounts of power established professors in the field have over trainees' lives and futures, it's widely believed that it is likely much worse in academia, even though we don't have a lot of specific data about retaliation in academia right now. This is according to reports from the Chronicle of Higher Education and the National Academy of Sciences. Unlike other industries where if you have an abusive boss, you may be able to switch jobs and still keep a career in that same industry, a retaliating professor can destroy any chance of your having a career in academia at all. The discipline is interconnected across universities, so typically if you have a problem at University A, it's like you can't just switch and leave and go to University B. There are many other features of academia that make retaliation likely pervasive. Professors control what trainees work on, where they work, who gets credit for the work in terms of co-authorship on publications, who gets access to expensive lab equipment, grant money, and other research resources. Professors almost entirely anonymously control whether or not the student gets their degree at all, and whether they'll get a chance to interview for a job after via anonymous letters of recommendation. There's also a culture in which word of mouth carries a lot of weight. Mentors are often asked to anonymously provide opinions of trainees' suitability for career advancement in general. Established professors control who gets job interviews, who gets the jobs, who gets published, and who gets research funding. Having just one established person defaming you with no ability to defend yourself, that ruins careers. That fact, the fact that so much of the feedback is anonymous makes it even worse. It's never seen by the trainee, which means that the trainee is unable to know that the negative feedback is being introduced, and subsequently they're unable to respond to it. Finally, there's the tenure system, which is unique to academic institutions. This also causes more extreme employment inequity than other industries, where it's often easier to fire bad actors instead of protecting them. Another really important dynamic to understand here, the less powerful the person is, the worse the retaliation is. We know that from studies in other fields. This data is from a study of workplace dynamics in general, and even here, what you see is that without all of the components known to make retaliation worse, you see an increase in the severity of the retaliation as the power differential between the wrongdoer and the victim increases. Since this is thought to be, since this is known to be greater in academia, people's thinking on this is that the retaliation is also likely worse. We don't yet know how these dynamics play out in academia. There's a lack of data in that area. But if you look at the subset of stories represented in the public record via lawsuits and news stories, it doesn't look good. We're desperately in need of more research in this area to understand exactly how bad these problems are. When the Me Too movement first launched, first came to public consciousness, I think it did a really amazing job at instilling a new awareness of the problems with the harassment itself. But there's another layer to the problem that I think is not yet as popularly well understood and discussed as it needs to be. And I think that aspect of it, that layer, is arguably more important. This layer is how institutions respond to harassment complaints. It's not widely appreciated, but institutional investigations have a bias to find nothing. This was certainly true at the University of Rochester. Universities face an unresolvable conflict of interest in investigating themselves. If they admit problems, they increase their legal liability. If they admit that there was any defect in their system or process, or that the harassment occurred at their institution, they're making it easier for individuals to win lawsuits against that institution. This isn't university specific, but universities are certainly guilty of this. This leads to institutional investigations working really hard to portray anyone under the investigation in the rosiest terms possible, while simultaneously trying to complain anybody who's filing a complaint as lacking credibility. For example, in our case, they couldn't deny some of the indisputable facts about Florian Jaeger's behavior towards women, but they described it as colorful instead of sexist or misogynistic, or simply describing it for what it was, which was harassment. Likewise, sometimes universities pay outside attorneys and companies to investigate them to create the illusion of objectivity. In our case, the University of Rochester hired a firm called Debevoise and Plimpton. That same firm was hired just weeks later to conduct an investigation into the Harvey Weinstein case at the Weinstein Company after their allegations became public. This practice is very common. For example, when it became public that Larry Nassar had abused dozens of female U.S. Olympic athletes over many decades, the U.S. Olympic Committee hired another firm, Ropes and Gray, to supposedly investigate whether USOC officials knew about Larry Nassar's abuse. These outside entities are no better than the internal investigations. They are also biased to find nothing. Otherwise, they don't get hired by the next institution. Who would pay a firm millions of dollars to create a liability for them? They're there to create the illusion of independence and to help with PR problems, but they are not there to find the truth. Here is an example from our case of that bias to find nothing that I was just talking about. In our case, the investigator refused relevant evidence that witness offered to back their statements. Not once and not twice. This was the standard operating procedure. The investigator refused to interview women who'd been harassed and rejected messages and emails offered to them to corroborate the claims. 5 women in our case even wrote a letter to the provost stating that they had experienced or witnessed sexual harassment firsthand and wanted to testify, but they were still not interviewed by the University of Rochester investigators. When concerned faculty confronted Gail Norris, the vice president of the university, about this fact, she justified the decision not to look at evidence. She said that was how the process was supposed to operate, that if an accused person denies doing something, even if there's hard evidence that could be checked, the procedure that the university used said that they would not look at that evidence. When we confronted her, she chastised us for suggesting that that procedure made no sense. She asked us, why would you assume that the accused would lie, as though that was not obvious? This is the process that formed the basis of the conclusions of the official university investigation. I mentioned that that's conservative. That is why that is a conservative estimate of all of the things that he did. And presumably, the same process was used in many other investigations as well. When we pushed back against these processes, we had the resources of 7 faculty, a leading law firm on sexual harassment in the world, statements from many, many women. At this point, there are now 16 women who have reported problems. 16 women who had to distort their professional lives to avoid someone that the University of Rochester hired and still employs to be their mentor and their teacher. Even then, even with all of that, we could not make an inch of progress inside the university system. They defamed us, defamed and intimidated witnesses, refused to interview people who'd been harassed, denied mistakes, and refused to seriously engage. Even after we filed a federal EEOC complaint that detailed all of the failures of their investigative process, they stood behind that investigation. After we went public, the university's then president, Joel Seligman, compared our case to a fabricated story about rape on campus published by Rolling Stone. That story had been based on a single anonymous source. By contrast, at this point, our case already had 11 women reporting firsthand experience with problems, with corroborating evidence. We were students and alumni of the university. We were not anonymous. They knew who we were. It was not an accident that the university's first public response was to get everyone to remember a prior fabricated accusation. Doubting makes victims scared to report, to file charges, or to protest when their case is mishandled. The fewer people report, the better for the institution. It reduces their assault numbers in federally mandated reports, and it prevents bad press. When the statement failed to subdue public outrage, the university then paid $4.5 million to the same law firm that the Weinstein Company hired to lead an investigation into the case. They did this completely aware that the investigation couldn't include us because we had a pending lawsuit. No competent lawyer would permit their clients to be interviewed outside of a courtroom by a law firm that had been hired by the defense. This meant that the $4.5 million was spent to produce a report that included none of our evidence, nothing from the primary complainants, and the university still assured everyone that it was comprehensive. And yet, even without our evidence, even without us, the investigation confirmed nearly all of our claims. That Yeager had behaved inappropriately, damaged at least 10 women's careers, slept with an undergraduate, slept with numerous department visitors and graduate students, and sent unwanted sexual images. All of that was confirmed. None of that is debated. At this point, they couldn't deny much of what had happened, but even then, they didn't take responsibility. When they couldn't deny the bad behavior any longer, they switched their strategy to admitting the events, but trying to claim that these behaviors didn't meet an impossibly high threshold of what should constitute sexual harassment. This outcome, thus, was that the events occurred, but they still didn't constitute sexual harassment. Who would hire them on the next $4.5 million case if the results harmed the university in its upcoming lawsuit? Here's just one example of how far they went in trying to excuse him. Their gist was that Yeager was so distasteful for other reasons that it was hard to establish harassment in spite of everything that they confirmed. I'm going to quote from the University of Rochester's report. A combination of Yeager's harsh and demeaning language, flirtatious behavior, use of sexual innuendo, promiscuous reputation, open relationships with students, and blurring of social and professional lines all contributed to some extent to students avoiding him. But we cannot unravel the degree to which women avoided Yeager because of the sexual elements of his conduct as opposed to other simply offensive or unappealing aspects of his personality. I failed to mention this earlier. It's like the university promoted him in the middle of the first investigation. They didn't even wait for the outcome. This defense captures in a nutshell the kind of toxic attitude college administrator that leads to college administrators that leads cases like ours to explode. When this came out, was not the first time we'd faced this kind of denial of the truth. This is what we were facing all along. In addition to taking this ridiculous stance, the investigation also de-anonymized female student witnesses to whom it had explicitly offered confidentiality. Women that cooperated with their outside investigation under the promise that their identities would remain confidential. They de-anonymized them. The big point here is that these are not mistakes. This is what happens when an institution is caught unambiguously protecting a serial sexual harasser and faces a serious PR problem. This is how institutions work to protect themselves legally at the cost of the women who complain. Institutions often will say that they support victims in the abstract, but then they deny the existence of actual real victims when they complain. This was certainly what happened in our case. Worse, they attack them. But here is the most disturbing aspect of watching Rochester handle this case. The legal office that handled our case is the same one that handles undergraduate sexual assault cases. Several undergraduate students had reached out to me for help before we went public with our federal complaint, and many, many more have reached out to me after. Their assaults were horrific. How their cases were handled, though, was far, far worse. To be victimized in an assault is traumatizing enough, but then to be betrayed by the system that's supposed to exist to protect you, that's a whole nother level of wrong. I cannot imagine facing what I faced as a younger, more vulnerable undergraduate student. I can't imagine facing what I faced alone. I can't imagine facing what I faced in the wake of the trauma of a sexual assault. I couldn't have imagined these things, but I've heard dozens of these stories. Students who report their cases were closed because the investigator found a classmate who called them a slut. Students who report that their cases were closed because they were intoxicated or drugged at the time of their assault, and therefore they didn't remember not consenting. One student told me that an investigator suggested to her that if she was drugged, she couldn't be sure then that she hadn't drugged herself. I've heard from students who were intimidated out of complaining further because they couldn't produce videos of their assaults. I've heard from students who were talked out of filing criminal charges because they were told that the graphic details of their assault could be made public if they did, and that would cause suffering to their families. I've heard from students who were asked to provide their medical records to the attorneys at their universities to prove that they were mentally stable enough to be making a credible complaint, only to have those medical records used to threaten and intimidate them out of pushing the complaint further. These students face a 1-2 punch, first surviving physical assault, and then, at their most vulnerable, not being believed, being betrayed by the entity that's supposed to exist to protect them. If you leave here remembering one thing about the story, please remember this. The systems for handling complaints at institutions like the University of Rochester are not there to protect the students or the employees. They're there to protect the institution from lawsuits and from bad press. In that role, they function very well. That term is so common, it even has a name. I think it's sometimes called file drawer policies, file drawer compliance. The result of all of this is that high-ranking members of the institutions, be they faculty members or executives, when they misbehave, often they have huge legal and financial resources available to protect them. The people that they target don't. They're targeting people that are less powerful. Their victims are crushed and pushed out altogether. We saw that happen in our case, and have heard from dozens of others who faced Jaegers in their own careers. These difficulties in reporting or managing being harassed are even worse for individuals who face additional challenges, particularly people of color, who both face higher rates of harassment and assault, but also who have fewer resources available to them on average to handle them. That, in addition to the fact that when they report, implicit racism makes them even less likely to be heard and to be believed. In academia, more women than not experience sexual harassment, specifically 2 out of 3 women faculty by our best estimates. And this treatment has serious consequences. The victims of harassment who aren't here to speak today, the ones who've been pushed out, they're the ones who've been hurt the most. If we allow this to continue, there are cascading effects that hurt all of us, not just the victims. We lose out on the women who drop out of the race for their dream jobs, and we lose out of all of the work they could have done. Often, these dropouts happen in male-dominated areas like science, technology, higher education, medicine, and mathematics. These dynamics, which force women to quit in order to end abuse, create an imbalance that means it's harder to find female mentors who understand these kinds of problems. There's fewer women at the top levels that are able to change the policy to make things better. Sexual harassment causes women and minorities to drop out of disciplines in which they're already underrepresented. It also leaves harassers left to make the next set of funding and hiring decisions without people present who understand how big of a problem this is and what has to happen in order to fix it. So, it's like, what do we do? Is the million-dollar question. I'm going to make a few suggestions for ideas that me and many others have. I want to say, though, that I don't think anyone has all of the answers. It's like we're really missing data, the data that we need to make fully informed decisions. And some of these things we're going to have to try. I was like, we're going to have to try and make things better, collect more data, and iterate until it gets better. The first thing that needs to happen is like people who report need some support. In academia, that means vocal faculty allies that understand the process, that will support students when the institution predictably won't. More generally, people who report need people with power behind them to ask questions about the process and to question authority when authority is making decisions that put them in harm's way. Number two, people who report need options for how and for when. Right now, there are extremely limited statute of limitations on when harassment can be reported for action to be taken, at least in the United States. Some of these made a lot of sense when we were relying on people's memories more. But one of the things that has been really surprising to me since we went public and since students began reaching out and telling me their stories is the amount of evidence that is often that are often part of these cases. I have yet to hear a case of a so-called he said, she said. There's more and more documentation because there's more and more social interaction happening via email and text messages now with smartphones. People are walking around with videos and cameras on their phones. So the idea of a statute of limitations, one of the motivations is making sure that people don't misremember in cases where there is hard evidence, where you don't, there's no question about what happened because there is a video of it and text messages to confirm what everyone was thinking. Some of these statute of limitations don't all make sense anymore. I also want to mention, this is especially true in academia, people are not always in a position to come forward right away. I did not complain any louder than I did because it was very clear that I would be crushed. That's essentially career suicide. We also had, in our case, a substantial amount of evidence so that there could be no question about what exactly happened for the claims that we were making. We don't have good systems right now for being able to hear people out, to evaluate these evidence, and we really need that in order to move forward. Okay, number three, institutions can't police themselves. You can't expect them to police themselves. So it's like they face a conflict of interest in this. What this means is that these current systems that we have for reporting need some substantial rethinking and some substantial reworking. We need mechanisms providing the less powerful with truly independent reporting and reviews of the facts. Number four, entities without liability and conflict of interest issues really need to step up here, and they've already started to. Like, this is one avenue that I think we've already made a substantial amount of progress since Me Too exploded. Entities that have power in the form of money or influence need to wield it in order to make things better. In academia, that means policymakers, research funders, publishers, and professional organizations. All of these entities are in a really strong position to make really big differences by making commitments to require universities to do better. Otherwise, you pull the funding or you pull the influence. The National Science Foundation, NIH, the National Academy of Sciences have all stepped up in this regard, and it's become increasingly common for professional organizations to do things like have codes of conduct at their conferences and penalties for if they are broken. And second thing is less common. I hope it becomes more common. Number 5, this one is maybe the most controversial. People who abuse their power need to lose their power, or the cycle continues. They use it to retaliate against the people who complain and to promote people who enable or tolerate their bad behavior. It's not an accident that sexual harassment rates in the workplace in general have been stable for 3 decades now. There can't be no consequences. Likewise, administrators who are complicit in covering up bad behavior, they also need to face consequences. There have to be deterrents in place. I would add here that I am not advocating for anyone who is ever accused of anything to just be removed with no sort of process for evaluating the evidence. Quite the contrary, I'm saying that there needs to be a system established for reviewing evidence fairly, and there need to be consequences for when a violation is found. And number 6, we need to keep talking about these things. I was like, you guys are all playing an important role in the change that needs to happen by being here today and by thinking about these issues. When I talk about this, sometimes people come up to me afterwards and they say, oh, this is really horrible. It's like you must walk around being really depressed all of the time. I do not feel that way at all. Like, in fact, I've never been more optimistic about the future for women in science and for women and everyone else is like facing sexual harassment challenges. Things have been horrible for a really long time. Just not everybody was on the same page with understanding how widespread the problem was. Talking, bringing more transparency to these issues is a really, really crucial and big first step. Bringing stuff out in the open where we can see it, we can dissect it, we can analyze what went wrong, and we can analyze how to do better. Collecting data, as far as I can tell, is the only way forward. Corruption thrives in shadows, and sunshine is a very powerful disinfectant. I want to conclude by showing you some pictures of the students at the University of Rochester from the Campus Times, the local newspaper at University of Rochester, as well as some local news sources like the Democrat and Chronicle. The students at the University of Rochester have stepped up to demand better for themselves, and I'm optimistic that they're going to keep fighting for the protections they deserve. This is a picture of the students who organized a protest after a complaint went public. Them stepping up in this way is not what I expected to happen when we went public. I didn't really expect them to notice. So it's like doing an undergraduate degree is a lot. They're juggling a lot. Instead, by sharing our stories publicly, it helped them make sense of their own experiences there. They saw injustice, and they've taken it upon themselves to do everything in their power to help correct it. I'm constantly in awe of them and their deep understanding of these issues. Most of their protest signs, is like most of what they were upset about, were not things that were specifically detailed in our federal complaint or later our lawsuits. They recognized in our complaints things that had happened to them and their friends when they went to that same office. I didn't anticipate that happening, but I'm very happy it did, because recognizing the problem is the first step to addressing it. Thanks to them, the president of the University of Rochester, Joel Seligman, resigned just as the second investigation was about to be made public. He cited their questioning of him during a town hall that they asked him to have as a pivotal moment in his decision-making process. There's video of that on YouTube, I think, still, if anybody is interested. I am completely in awe of how awake, aware, and caring the undergraduate students are at the University of Rochester. That's why I love being a professor there, and they are no less awe-inspiring since I have left. It's not just him, though. The head attorney at the university, Gail Norris, also recently announced her retirement. Florian Yeager is still teaching there. The University of Rochester, despite everything it confirmed, is still entrusting him to train students and to shepherd them into their professional careers and lives. But you guys are in a special position to keep this progress that they have started going. You can do that by conveying a very simple message to those that are less powerful than you. If you report harassment to me, you will be supported. I'll listen, I'll stand with you, I'll defend you. That's what the people who you employ, the people who you work with, the people who you help need to hear. That they have an ally who can support them against pressures that would prefer that victims stay silent. Thank you so much for having me. Yes.
Yourself and Ivana want to. So thank you so much for sharing that harrowing experiences and the insights that you take from them. It's really quite, like I said, it's really quite unbelievable what you went through. But you spelled out in your talk this really clear way how the hierarchy, the hierarchical nature of academia combined with institutions' really strong drive towards self-protection can lead to this situation where harassment can continue and it can go unchecked, where victims are silenced, or if they speak out, then retaliation is a given. And that can be devastating for careers. So it's been a total eye-opener for me and probably for many people here in the audience. It's a conversation that's just starting here. So we're really grateful that you could share those experiences with us. And the organizers really hope that this discussion and the fact-based argument that you presented can help people across the academic spectrum, so faculty, researchers, students, everybody in the university who've experienced harassment or a hostile environment to feel empowered to start speaking out, but also that it empowers those of us who feel that we haven't been affected to start listening to those stories and supporting those who tell them. So I'm going to start this part of the evening with some questions for you and Ivana, and then we'll go to the audience for some questions. So my first question kind of picks up on what I just said, that we know that this harassment is quite pervasive, it's not universal, right? So some estimates are between 1/3 and 2/3 of women will experience it. And Ivana, on this you've said it is invisible unless you experience it. And I think this is really true, and sometimes it's hard to believe in something that is invisible, and sometimes the stories that you hear are quite hard to believe. It is hard to believe that a professor did the things that the report from the university confirmed that he did. And I think this is, this kind of unbelievable nature of the situation, and maybe some, natural cynicism has led some people to kind of question, the Me Too movement. And after all, a hashtag that quickly followed Me Too was I believe her. So how can we address this? How can we, what can we do to kind of reduce people's skepticism about the validity of people's complaints? How can we get everybody on side?
I would, I think things like the hashtag I believe her were well-intentioned. I was like, they were motivated by the idea that although false reports occur, there are empirical studies of this, their estimated rates are very, very low, somewhere around 5%. So based on base rates, if you had no other evidence, that's what I think people were trying to communicate. People are not believed, and they should be. But I think that it accidentally led people to believe that they were being asked to believe something just because. I was like, and I don't know of a case where that has happened. I don't know of a student that reported something and asked to be believed just on the face of what they were reporting. You're really going out on a limb when you put yourself out there. I was like, that the person that you're reporting is likely going to retaliate. I was like, that your chances of anything happening in the institution are low. People generally don't do that unless they have corroborating evidence. So I would clarify that you don't want to believe believe people just cause. I was like, you want to believe evidence. You want to look at the evidence. I would never ask somebody to just have blind faith. I would ask them to hear the person out. I was like, to understand what a person's conflict is when they're commenting on a story. I was like, a university issues a press release saying everything's fine here. Understanding that they have to do that to protect themselves from a lawsuit, and taking that in context is what I think people meant with that abbreviated, I believe, for hashtag.
Yeah, I mean the question about how we talk, how do we get people to understand the extent of this? I think that is it's a difficult question. I think it's one of these things that for a long time we spoke about among ourselves as women. And I was struck by this recently, speaking at a HIS debate on sexual harassment here on campus, run by undergrad students. And one level it was depressing, because clearly young women students are still experiencing the same levels of harassment that we experienced on campus and elsewhere. And but what was encouraging and very positive and affirming was the way in which we were speaking about it in a mixed group of men and women. And what's been encouraging, I think, since Me Too is what an eye-opener it's been to so many men who were genuinely unaware of the extent of this. And it's such common language. There's such common language among women about some guy who's sleazy, some guy who's a bit handsy. We all know what that means, and usually the same few individual men who everybody knows to be in this category. So not in any way to tarnish all men at all, but for a lot of men, I think this was something they were unaware of. And we do have evidence, as you said, Celeste. I mean, the Este study, the National Women's Council have compiled with 5 EU countries. They were able to compile data to show that across the 5 countries, between 47% and 68% of women, depending on the country the study was done in, had reported experiencing sexual harassment, verbal or non-verbal, unwanted sexual advances in higher education. So there's good data out there now in terms of sexual harassment on campus. But I do think a key issue is just speaking about it openly. And actually a parallel for me was recently in the Shannon and in the Dáil, we had motions brought through by the Women's Caucus on periods, on menstruation. And again, it was something that suddenly we're speaking about this. And for years, for decades and generations, this has been something that women have only spoken about among ourselves in private company. And it's not something that's been shared in a public forum or in a mixed grouping. And sexual harassment, to me, obviously they're completely different, but the way in which we speak about them is similar. There's almost a taboo about speaking about these sort of experiences unless you're in a very private group that is gender specific. So I think that's one way of naming it, making people aware, particularly other men, aware of the extent of it, and then you can start to address it. But because I think that was a difficulty that the Me Too movement came up against. The sort of backlash was, well, it can't be that extensive. It's not as pervasive. You're overstating it.
Right.
Actually, no, we're not. All of us know this. From anyone who's been, as I said, in a powerless position. Particularly in a powerless position where you're more prone to this. I mean, I worked years in waitressing and catering, and there was a huge amount of sexual harassment. Of course there was, and all of us were subjected to it, and it was well known because there were people in positions of power in a very hierarchical industry, catering and restaurants, and that still goes on. But we have to name it and address it. So.
I suppose a related question then would be, because I appreciate the importance of naming it and talking about it, but often that then puts the burden on people who have been victims to talk about that, and we know about the negative repercussions of that on victims. I suppose a related question is, Celeste, how did you find the courage to speak out when you did? Because I know that you said you didn't for a long time because you feared being crushed. How did you finally speak out?
Right. So that is an important point too, I think. I would have loved to go my whole life avoiding the issue entirely. It's like I would have liked to never bring it to light. I would have liked to never have to face the risk or relive any of the trauma. But I was like, I reached a point at which I had a choice. It became evident to me that what had happened to me had happened to others. I was like, and this is a very common story. And I had a decision to make. I could support them. I was like, I could do what I could to support them. Not just them. At this point, I'm a faculty member in the same department where he is. It's like he teaches classes that my students may take. I could stay quiet and knowingly put my students in harm's way and be complicit, or I could not. And I wasn't okay. I wasn't okay being complicit. When I participated, when I went into the investigator at the University of Rochester, I spoke on the condition of confidentiality. I was told that my name and my identity would be kept secret. The university, as universities do with other people, broke that promise. The university outed me, I believe, as a mechanism for threatening others. It's like I told them that this happened to other people. If you out one person, if their life becomes terrible, that's a really powerful deterrent to other people. I mentioned that he was promoted in the middle of the first investigation, so imagine that you're a woman who's been negatively impacted by his behavior and you're thinking about talking, and then he posts that on Facebook. I was like, it was a pretty clear signal to us that of what the outcome was going to be. It's a clear signal that the university is going to whitewash it. You've gone out on a limb. I was like, if you disclose things even anonymously, but you're identifiable, and they outed that person, it's a threat to keep people quiet. So I would love to be courageous. I was not courageous. The university outed me, and I had no other action to take that I could live with.
I'm a little bit conscious of time, and we wanted to take some questions from the audience.
The presentation was really good, and I just wondering, I used to be in academia, but I finished my studies, but do you think that this type of studies will be applicable for women doing research in institutions, not necessarily academia, but any type of research? You know, nowadays, especially with entrepreneurship, there's many women who work. It's a kind of maybe half academia, half for a private company. I think this model, whatever you presented, perhaps is applicable for other situations, and really, really interesting presentation. Well done.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It's like most of the data we have is from companies, from industry at large, not academia. I think these dynamics are relevant there too. It's weird when you compare. I was like, what happens to a professor who is called out? How much evidence there is? Usually not much happens. You compare that to someone like Kevin Spacey as like somebody that's working for a non-academic institution. It doesn't go the way that I would have expected before I was involved in this. I now appreciate that if you're interested in protecting your image, academia has another problem, which is people generally perceive it to be a very liberal place where people are very progressive, and people have a bias to think the university wouldn't do this, like to its students. They think that the institution is there to act in favor of the students, and the universities completely exploit that. They have to do less to convince people that they are good because of that bias. So I think in some senses that makes things worse, counterintuitively.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for this very inspiring speech. And I wanted to make kind of comment / question, because what I think I've been lucky in my career. I'm assistant professor in UCD, and I never had this kind of problem. But then I met other people that kind of passed this problem. And I think my personal career, I always been very naive, and so never really talk about this. And when I started to talk up with this person, I realized that there is a vast amount of people who think that this is normal. So if you want to stay in academia, you just have to put your head down and go on in this way. One person there were two friends, and one decided to change PhD supervisor, moved to another university. She kind of discovered a whole new world. And I thank you, first of all, for speaking up and for making, I think, a lot of people aware that this is not, I think, the way it is everywhere, and that you can make some reactions. But I also wanted to hear your opinion about this fact that people so sometimes think that this is normal and you have to just wait and hope.
I don't know if you have insights into that. I'm sure you've encountered that attitude.
Yes, I think so. I think it is normalized to some extent, and that, you know, it's one of these things that women have had to deal with for so long without really being able to vocalize about it, except in very small private groups, as I've said. So I think that's part of the difficulty, you know. And I mean, I was very struck by Celeste's point about institutions. I mean, it's outrageous that the institution outed you. That's shocking. And of course, it's also wrong to always emphasize the duty on the victim to speak out. I mean, that's also the wrong way around. And, you know, here, the employers, institutions, universities have an obligation to protect employees and to secure dignity at work, and we have legislation on that too. And maybe we don't talk enough about that, the top-down duty that the employer has to ensure that there is dignity and respect for employees. I mean, that's the name of our code and of conduct in this university and in others. The Code Against Sexual Harassment is a code of dignity and respect at work, and that's really where the duty should lie and the emphasis should be.
I've heard that attitude espoused by more senior colleagues, and often I was like they're calling on their own personal experiences. They say something like, when I was in graduate school, I experienced something worse, and I'm still here. And to that, I say, I'm so glad. I was like, I'm so glad that you're still here. I'm so glad that it didn't lead you to drop out. I am happy that you survived it. But if you look around, I was like, look at how many women were not able to because their circumstance was different. There's a leaky pipeline in academia, especially in STEM and medicine, in STEM fields, and those base rates. It's like some of the women were able to make it through. All of the women should have an equal opportunity based on their merits to make it through. We shouldn't be filtering out the ones that are not able to manage it for whatever reason, be it internal or external. That's not fair. I was like, my email, I have modern technology for communicating with people, so feel free to reach out.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, how would you encourage women to speak up about more subtler issues? Now, obviously, harassment is terrible, but there must be, and I'm sure there are, more subtler issues in academia that probably prevent women from climbing the ladder as quick as men can do, and, like, I don't know, the inequalities that might impact their research output, the citations they receive. How would you encourage them to speak about this kind of issues that they might not necessarily even be aware of the fact that they are present, but they are more or less being affected by it?
I like the comment that you made about we can't expect them to do all of the stuff. I'm a scientist. I was like, you always solve a solution with what you know. I was like, I think the answer is data. I was like, we need more research on this topic to understand what the problem is so we can figure out how to address it. To individuals, I was like, I say, whether or not you've experienced it, you can be an ally. It's important that you make your stance known on these issues, how you feel about this. This is increasingly important as you have power. Even if it's not that much power, you're a graduate student and you can communicate this to a class of undergraduates. Whatever power you have, making yourself available to help out somebody with less is important. I would not say, some people say, it's like talk about everything no matter what. Right now, the retaliation threat is real, it's serious, it's likely. We don't know exactly how bad it is. What I say to people is, report what you can, however you can, whenever you can. If you're experiencing something you can't talk about immediately, seek out help to the degree that you can, document what you can, and I wouldn't ask somebody to jeopardize, to put their career on the line in the name of social justice. So it's like if they end up having to drop out, we don't have them to help make things better down the road. I'm interested in the legal. I was like, what the
That's
legal?
really good legal advice.
Oh, good. My attorney has had an influence on me.
Yeah, to document everything and complain and make a complaint any way you can. But the fear of victimization is very real, and I'm struck by your point about other forms of unfair treatment and discrimination. I mean, one of the Athena Swan process purposes is to try and uncover and address those kind of discriminations, the sort of affinity bias that stops recruiters from recruiting people who aren't like them, and therefore militates against women or against people from different disadvantaged groupings and so on. So that's the kind of thing that we have to address through different means. But positive action programs and all of that, mentoring. There's an awful lot of different things that can be done, short of legal action.
Sorry, I'll just get my slides up. Hello, everyone. My name is Roisin Loftus, and I'm part of Women in Research Ireland, who, together with the Wellcome Trust funded Neurohumanities series, co-organised this event. Just for those of you that aren't aware, Women in Research Ireland is a volunteer-run charity group that represent women and other minorities in academia across all disciplines. And we aim to provide a platform to hear individuals that are often silenced in academia. So by organising essentially events like this one, as well as workshops. So you can follow us on Twitter at womeninres.ie to hear about our upcoming events. But what I'm here today to do is just to provide a list of support networks that are available for anyone that may have been affected by this event. So firstly, the Irish Human Rights Equality Commission has a 30-page document which is on the Code of Practice on Sexual Harassment and Harassment at Work. And this outlines what's meant by sexual harassment, how it can be prevented, and what steps to take if it does occur in order to deal with the problem, but then also prevent its reoccurrence. In addition, the Rape Crisis Centre here in Ireland has a 24-hour helpline. Here's their email addresses, and their physical address of their main office is located just around the corner on Leeson Street, with the opening hours of 8 till 5:30 Monday to Friday and 9 to 3:30 on Saturdays. Lastly, here's just a brief list of some of the Trinity-based support networks. So bullying and harassment is covered by Trinity's Dignity and Respect policy. On page 30 of this document, you'll find a list of specially trained individuals and contact persons that can help advise students and staff affected by either sexual harassment and/or bullying. In addition, any Trinity-based members in the audience should have got an email last week from our Dean of Research, Professor Linda Doyle, which outlined a new initiative called #DignityRespect. And this is essentially starting small, externally facilitated focus groups for students and staff that are going to start the conversation about sexual harassment in Trinity and to help set expectations of this university for dealing with sexual harassment. In addition, HR also have a helpline and they provide counselling support. The Postgrad Advisory Service offer confidential advice and support. And in addition, the student-to-student counselling service also offers either one-on-one or group counselling sessions, as well as online support. And furthermore, any undergrads in the audience shouldn't overlook the importance of their supervisors that can help them navigate these important resources. So with that, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Senator Vanna Bacchick for opening tonight's proceedings so eloquently, and to Dr. Claire Kelly for chairing such a thought-provoking discussion, and above all, of course, to Professor Celeste Kidd for sharing her experiences and insight in the hope that it can instill confidence in those that are thinking about speaking out against sexual harassment in academia. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending.